In 2024, a sci-fi psychological thriller television series has arrived. After narrowly escaping death from the International Space Station, astronaut Joe returns to Earth only to find that familiar people and things have undergone eerie changes. Driving with her daughter Alice on a remote countryside road, the radio repeats hoarse whispers. Joe pretends to reassure Alice that everything is normal as they arrive at a small cabin in the forest. After packing their belongings, Joe quickly hides a backpack containing metal cans. Suddenly, Alice's voice is heard from a distance, even though Alice is clearly sleeping in the room. Joe seems to realize something and resolutely walks towards the sound. 5 weeks earlier, when Joe was still aboard the International Space Station, through a video call, she tells Alice that she will soon return to Earth. Today, they will embark on a special mission, to experiment with a newly discovered substance that can only remain active in zero gravity. Just as everything is ready, the commander has just started the experimental equipment when a loud noise echoes through the space station. Immediately, the pressure drops sharply, and an iron rod flies in, piercing the commander's arm directly. The ground command center issues an emergency notice. There's a sudden malfunction on the space station, ordering all astronauts to enter Escape Pod 1 and execute the emergency evacuation procedure. At this moment, Joe's compartment has returned to normal. She sees a colleague trapped by a fire in the corridor. Quickly grabbing a fire extinguisher, she clears a path and successfully leads the colleague to escape. After closing the hatch to the burning compartment, they begin to take a head count. The situation of the commander is the most critical, as he has fallen into unconsciousness due to his severed arm. Joe assumes the role of acting commander. She and the doctor stay behind to administer emergency treatment to the commander, while the others go to inspect the damage inside the space station. One piece of bad news after another floods in. The power and life support systems of the space station are damaged. Escape Pod 1's power system is malfunctioning, while Escape Pod 2 is available but only has 3 seats. Inside the ground command center, Henry, the project leader, sees the experimental data just before the accident and can't help but sigh in amazement. He then issues a bewildering command: regardless of the circumstances, the astronauts must repair the space station and continue the experiment. Joe, upon receiving the order, reluctantly puts on her spacesuit and heads into outer space to perform repairs. When she arrives at the damaged section of the space station, she discovers that the power supply system has suffered a severe impact, with all external cables destroyed. Without the proper equipment, she cannot reconnect the cables. Upon learning of this outcome, the ground commander immediately orders all astronauts to return to Earth, completely ignoring Henry's strong protests. At that moment, the sun happens to pass over the horizon, illuminating the location of the space station. Joe, using the light, unexpectedly discovers a 50-centimeter crack in the station's hull. As Joe approaches to inspect, she moves aside a cable and is met with a terrifying sight: the face of a person. The impact object turns out to be the body of an astronaut. Startled, Joe loses her balance, and if it weren't for the safety tether, she might have drifted off into space herself. After finally returning to the compartment, Joe receives yet another unfortunate piece of news: the commander has passed away due to excessive bleeding. Now there are only 4 astronauts left, but the escape pod can only accommodate 3. Everyone looks at each other, clearly reluctant to stay behind. In the end, Joe makes the decision to stay behind and repair the other escape pod, while the other 3 return to Earth. The command center immediately approves this plan because the space station's life support system can only sustain 1 person for 19 hours. After the 3 teammates enter the escape pod and initiate the separation procedure, Joe watches them drift away, feeling deeply saddened. She longs to reunite with her family. At this moment, Alice and Joe's husband, Magnus, have already boarded a special plane bound for the command center, accompanied by the former commander's daughter. Their greatest wish is to see their loved ones returning to Earth as soon as possible, and Joe is making every effort to make that happen. The escape pod's power system was damaged in the accident and requires all batteries to be replaced. As time ticks by, the command center finally receives good news: the escape pod carrying the 3 astronauts has successfully entered the atmosphere and landed safely, with no injuries. Meanwhile, Joe, instead of continuing the power repair work, retrieves a bracelet necklace that her daughter gave her. She can part with anything except for this necklace. During the repair process, Joe receives a new task from the command center, requiring her to retrieve the new substance and experimental apparatus from the experimental compartment. It turns out that Henry had previously requested the escape pod to bring back the items to Earth, but the instruction was intercepted by Irina, the person in charge of the ground command center, who believed that the accident was likely related to the experiment with the new substance. Henry is furious, his lips trembling as he berates Irina for not understanding the significant importance of the experiment, which could change the entire world. Irina, feeling uncertain, reluctantly issues the retrieval order to Joe. However, Joe doesn't immediately agree because she can't guarantee that she'll have time to go to the laboratory after replacing the batteries. Just then, Magnus and Alice finally arrive at the command center. Just as they are about to communicate, the communication signal suddenly cuts off. Joe is very anxious, watching as the emergency lights start to go out one by one, indicating that the power is running out. She has to set aside distractions and speed up the repair process. Suddenly, a sound breaks the silence in the compartment, prompting Joe to follow its source. As she arrives at the laboratory, the surroundings suddenly change, and Joe finds herself inside a building. Curious, she explores ahead until she reaches the end of a corridor, where she sees the necklace her daughter gave her. When she turns back, the surroundings revert to the appearance of the space station. Alice's call brings Joe back to reality and she continues toward the source of the sound. Before long, she arrives at a wooden cabin and curiously surveys her surroundings. Time seems to stand still here. Astonished, Joe pushes open the door and finds that the furnishings inside are identical to those in her own cabin. When she reaches the end of the corridor again, she sees Alice's necklace once more. Upon opening the door, she is surprised to find another Alice inside. Without time to think, she immediately picks up Alice and heads toward her own cabin. Alice is mentally and physically drained from the extreme cold, and Joe hurriedly lights a fire and heats water, needing to warm Alice up quickly. But as she puts Alice into the bathtub, Joe suddenly remembers that there's another Alice lying in the room. She looks back and forth between them, completely puzzled as to why there were two Alice. When she enters the bathroom again, the Alice in the bathtub has disappeared. Meanwhile, the Alice sleeping in the room is awakened by the calling, and Joe approaches and sniffs her, realizing that the girl in front of her is not her own Alice. Suddenly, the surroundings change again, and Joe wakes up in the space station. She checks the time and realizes that she has been unconscious for several hours, likely due to low blood oxygen levels. With time running out, Joe has to accelerate the repair process. A piece of white cloth floats slowly towards her. She quickly shines her flashlight on it, only to find that the commander's body, at some unknown point, had opened its eyes. Joe's heart races, but she gathers the courage to close his eyes and cover his head with the white cloth once more. The environment around her is eerily quiet, so Joe decides to record her voice to dispel her fear. She hears hoarse voices coming from outside the compartment. However, when she stops recording, the voice suddenly disappears too. Joe plays back the previous recording and indeed hears a hoarse male voice mixed in. She then turns on her flashlight and checks again. She saw a floating arm through the window. Opening the hatch, she discovers it's the commander's severed arm. Joe couldn't tell if this was a paranormal event or just hallucinations due to lack of oxygen. She could only focus her attention on replacing the batteries. When there were only 90 minutes left, the power of the escape pod finally restored. Joe was about to initiate the separation procedure when she realized that due to the communication interruption, the escape pod hadn't received the latest return orbit parameters. She could only rely on the parameters used by another escape pod, combined with time, and amazingly, she simulated the latest orbit parameters manually. Seeing that she still had enough time, Joe went to the laboratory to retrieve the new substance and experimental apparatus. After inputting the orbit parameters, Joe recorded everything she wanted to say to her daughter into the tablet. The success of her return now rested solely on fate. After closing the hatch, she hesitated no further and initiated the detachment procedure. However, the system suddenly lit up with warning lights. Consulting the manual, Joe learned it was a bolt system malfunction, which required 2 people for manual troubleshooting. She felt chills down her spine. Was she really going to die here? But in the next moment, the malfunction miraculously resolved itself. As the escape pod slowly departed from the space station, Joe stared in disbelief because she saw a figure standing in the main compartment as it drifted away. This was the most thrilling space survival journey ever. As the escape pod approached the atmosphere, it began to separate in stages, ultimately hurtling towards the ground like a comet. The command center immediately captured the signal, but they found out that Joe was using a ballistic landing method, making it difficult to predict the landing site in advance. At this moment, Jo also received a signal from the command center. She struggled to open the communication button, and the command center was instantly filled with joy and encouragement the moment they heard Jo's voice. However, as the escape pod continued to accelerate, the command center lost the location signal again. They could only dispatch a large number of personnel to search within the estimated range of the fall. Shortly after, the escape pod landed at a safe altitude, and the deployed parachute gripped it tightly like the arm of a giant. With a loud bang, Jo finally landed successfully. When she woke up from unconsciousness and opened the hatch, Jo greedily breathed in the long-lost air, only to see a wild wolf approaching her. She froze in fear, but just as the wolf was about to pounce on her, a gunshot rang out in the distance. It turned out to be the search and rescue team, and a large number of medical and armed personnel surrounded Jo protectively. It wasn't until she saw the figures of Magnus and Alice that she felt a sense of relief. However, the commander's family wasn't so fortunate. All they received was his cold body. And Henry's greatest concern was still the newly discovered substance. He eagerly started up the instruments to examine the experimental data inside, but he didn't notice that the substance was emitting an eerie glow. At this moment, Jo was contentedly watching Alice, but the next moment there was only Alice left on the helicopter. She stood up and looked around, realizing that the whole world had become empty, and Jo had encountered the same situation. However, when she turned her head, Alice's figure reappeared, except her expression became somewhat vacant. When Jo instinctively spoke Dutch, Alice seemed completely unable to understand, and Magnus had no idea what was happening. As Alice watched Jo lying in the MRI for examination, she inexplicably thought that her mother was already dead. At the press conference the next day, reporters kept pressing for the cause of the space accident. When Jo was about to respond, her colleague immediately intervened, saying that the joint investigation was still ongoing and there was nothing to disclose at the moment. Jo just wanted to end it all as soon as possible and enjoy life with her family. However, the Joint Space Command headquarters explicitly required Jo to stay at the base and not go anywhere until the cause of the accident was thoroughly investigated. Under various pressures, a grand accident investigation hearing was officially launched, with all 4 surviving astronauts present. The head of the investigation team, Irina, was affiliated with the Russian Space Agency. When she heard that Jo witnessed the impact on the space station caused by the body of a female Soviet astronaut from the 1960s, she immediately reasoned that it couldn't be possible. How could a corpse float in space full of debris for decades? Moreover, the Joint Command had never received any reports of astronauts dying or missing in the nearby area. She believed that the so-called female corpse was just a hallucination caused by Jo's lack of oxygen. Both sides refused to back down because once the impact object was confirmed to be the Soviet female corpse, Russia would bear the main responsibility for the accident. Later, Jo returned to the dormitory for a meal and noticed that Magnus had changed his hairstyle, which she really liked. Magnus seemed uncomfortable, as the old Jo had never complimented him like this before. However, later that night, while Jo was on her way to the bathroom with Alice's assistance, she accidentally fell down. She asked Alice to go find Magnus for help. When Jo turned her head, she found that the corridor had suddenly transformed into the one she had encountered on the space station. At the end of the corridor, the bracelet necklace still hung, and even when Magnus ran over to help her up, the eerie corridor remained unchanged. In the laboratory on the other side, Henry was confidently introducing the newly discovered substance to his assistant. He explained how, at the moment of collision, the substance could generate dual quantum signals, but it was difficult to record them. He wanted to conduct another experiment at the base, but the entire afternoon passed, and the substance showed no signs of change. The assistant, holding almost blank data, persuaded Henry not to waste any more effort, but he insisted that he had seen the data before. Just yesterday, when he retrieved the instrument, he did indeed detect the dual quantum state, exactly like the data in the space station laboratory. Stubborn Henry ignored his assistant's skeptical look and kept watch at the monitoring instrument. Near midnight, the mysterious dual quantum signal finally appeared. He tried to record it with his phone but found that it couldn't display on the screen. He had to resort to pen and paper, sketching the dual quantum state in a simplified form. The next day, Henry excitedly showed it to his assistant, only to be praised for his drawing skills. Dejected, Henry left the laboratory, failing to notice that the substance in the instrument was emitting light again. His attention was completely drawn to the strange phenomenon downstairs. A girl in black had just run into the garage, followed by another girl of similar build carrying a toy rabbit. It turned out that Alice was playing hide-and-seek with the daughter of the deceased commander. When Alice saw the girl throw her beloved doll on the ground and stomp on it, she quickly intervened. However, the girl and the doll disappeared. Alice questioned her, but the girl accused Alice of distorting the truth just to reclaim her doll. When Alice picked up the toy to inspect it, there was no trace of dirt on it. Alice was pondering what had happened when Henry approached and initiated a conversation about quantum physics. Obviously, he had sensed something earlier and intended to enlighten Alice. Henry stated that many phenomena in this world cannot be explained by classical physics theories. For instance, the same thing can exist in two different states simultaneously, just like the rabbit appears white in one world and may be gray in another. And there exists a critical space between two worlds, where the color of the rabbit can switch between white and gray at any moment. Alice listened, seeming to grasp the concept vaguely, while Henry's experiment with the newly discovered substance aimed to simulate the dual quantum state in the critical space, where objects could appear in two different states simultaneously. And Jo faced her second hearing. This time, Irina brought more convincing evidence. Based on the style of the spacesuit Jo provided, she found the space garbage bag thrown out by the space station in the 1970s. The two looked remarkably similar, leading to the possibility that Jo, under immense pressure, mistook the garbage bag for a body. Jo was rendered speechless this time. After the hearing, a colleague came to comfort her, expressing his support. He even attempted to touch Jo's face, but she recoiled, surprising the colleague with her reaction. The next morning, Jo and the other 3 astronauts prepared to pay their respects to the deceased commander. Jo still insisted she hadn't made a mistake. She even found a photo of the same style spacesuit online. A colleague reminded her that the astronaut in the photo was Irina. Jo was speechless with astonishment. After paying respects to the commander, she wanted to stay alone for a while. However, as she stood up, she saw the deceased commander in front of her, but after taking a closer look, there was nothing there. At the following hearing, Jo straightforwardly admitted to Irina's inference, stating that what she saw was indeed a space garbage bag because she no longer wanted to stay there. Finally returning home after a long time, Jo felt everything was so familiar, except she was curious about when Magnus changed the car at home was clearly red before. However, Magnus insisted the car had always been blue. On the other side, Irina knocked on Henry's door. So, they were not only colleagues at work, but had also undertaken missions together in space. Their personal relationship was also extraordinary. Henry learned that she had cancer and didn't have much time left. He wanted to cherish the few meetings they had left, but when emotions ran deep, Irina turned into a corpse. Meanwhile, on a cruise ship, another Henry summoned a detective who had been investigating him. He brought the detective to the deck, claiming he had never experienced a space accident in his life. However, the detective said that in a space station accident 30 years ago, it was highly likely that Henry had killed 2 colleagues. Henry's rage ignited, and he pushed the detective into the sea. Jo, who has never played the piano, finds her fingers instinctively dancing on the keys when she sees the sheet music. Upon safely returning from outer space, Jo discovers that the familiar world has become strange. Loved ones, colleagues, even the color of the car at home, all seem to have some discrepancies from her memory. Magnus and Alice are preparing to throw her a belated birthday party, and when they start playing a questioning game, the atmosphere freezes as Jo speaks her name in Dutch, something Magnus and Alice have never heard her say before. Yet Jo vividly remembers saying it more than once, with Alice even speaking some Dutch herself. Magnus is filled with suspicion. Confronting Jo about her seeming transformation since returning from space, their relationship had been strained before, and he was even contemplating divorce. Jo is shocked, exclaiming it's impossible, as she had longed to be back with Magnus every moment on the space station. Magnus remains unconvinced, prompting Jo to wonder if her memories are in disarray. She reevaluates every detail of her home and notices a piano in the living room, yet in her memory, no one in the household knows how to play. She wants to face it, and she was prepared to have a serious talk with Magnus. But Magnus immediately began to complain about various past grievances. In his mind, Jo had long lost her affection for the family. Even if she hadn't gone to the space station, every weekend was spent with Magnus alone, taking Alice to the cabin in the woods. Rumors among their friends had already spread about Jo having an affair with a colleague, and Magnus was fed up. He hoped Jo would openly admit it. Jo could hardly believe her ears after hearing this. She had never been involved with any colleague romantically. Her heart was only for Magnus and Alice. But how could Magnus easily believe otherwise? He promptly turned and left. Jo understood the seriousness of the situation, so she immediately sought out a psychologist. The change in Magnus and Alice's attitude, along with the distortion in her memory, brought significant distress to her life. The psychologist firmly diagnosed this as post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from Joe's life-threatening experience in space. Many high-risk professions, including soldiers, have experienced this illness, which, if severe, can lead to emotional volatility and loss of control. The psychologist prescribed a box of antidepressants to Joe, claiming it could effectively alleviate her stress responses. Joe reluctantly accepted the medication, but deep down, she resisted it. These types of psychotropic drugs could dull one's reactions, potentially preventing her from even being an astronaut anymore. Later, Joe put on her uniform and returned to the command center, where her colleagues welcomed the brave astronaut. However, Henry watched everything with a cold demeanor. He recalled a deadly incident at the space station decades ago, as if harboring a great secret. At that moment, Henry received some bad news. Due to the lack of progress in his experiment, the command center decided to suspend the project. Henry fell silent, lost in thought. Not long after, Henry approached Joe, inviting her to the laboratory under the pretext of an imminent breakthrough in the experiment. He casually asked Joe if she had encountered anything unexpected in space. Seeing her deep in thought, Henry mentioned a strange incident from many years ago. A colleague's son had died, and during his spaceflight, he encountered an accident. At a critical moment, he heard a boy's voice, which saved him from disaster. The colleague confirmed that the voice indeed belonged to his son. Henry had heard of similar occurrences before and encouraged Joe to recall carefully. At that moment, the experimental data seemed to fluctuate. Curiously, Joe approached to check, and her mind quickly flashed scenes from the space station. After leaving the command center, she prepared to pick up Alice from school. The teacher informed her that Alice had been behaving very withdrawn, possibly due to family circumstances. Joe noticed the teacher exchanging meaningful glances with Magnus from time to time. Upon returning home, she couldn't help but question Magnus about his relationship with the teacher. Magnus vehemently denied it, accusing Joe of being overly sensitive. Soon after, Joe discovered that Alice was missing. While searching, she unexpectedly found Alice hiding in the closet with her familiar bracelet necklace. When asked, Alice revealed that she often liked to hide in the closet for no reason. Joe felt a mixture of concern and bewilderment. Her impression of Alice was of an extremely outgoing child. When had she become so withdrawn? After Alice fell asleep, Joe approached the unfamiliar piano again. As her hands instinctively touched the keys, a clear melody began to play. Joe's expression turned to one of horror as she realized she had skillfully played the entire piece relying solely on muscle memory. It dawned on Joe that she was truly ill. She prepared to take the tranquilizers, but the pills seemed oddly familiar. During her rehabilitation training at the command center, the nutritionist had repeatedly emphasized the importance of taking vitamins. There happened to be a bottle at home that she hadn't finished. Joe took it out and carefully compared it with the tranquilizers. To her shock, she found that the vitamins provided by the base were identical to the tranquilizers. She hurried back to the command center to confirm whether these two were indeed the same medication. Ingredient identification revealed that the so-called vitamins from the base were actually tranquilizers that could induce dementia. Joe was incredulous. She couldn't fathom why the command center would do such a thing, so she rushed to the medical office to access the database. Medical records showed that several astronauts had been prescribed this medication, all sharing the common experience of seeing things they shouldn't have after returning from space. Suddenly, the room's lights came on, and two staff members entered to deliver documents. However, they seemed to completely ignore her presence. Joe shouted out in alarm, but when the room plunged back into darkness, the two employees had vanished without a trace. Joe felt a rising panic and had no desire to stay any longer. As she passed through the hallway, she spotted Henry still in his office. He was speaking to another version of himself on the screen. Suddenly, he turned and warned Joe, "Curiosity killed the cat." The next day, Joe was lost in thought when the colleague she was rumored to be involved with walked in, saying they needed to have a serious talk. He mentioned their agreement to leave together so they could be together forever. Joe's expression turned vacant. Now she couldn't discern which memories were real anymore. In the afternoon, Joe was invited to give a speech at Alice's school. She witnessed Magnus and the teacher's flirtatious behavior once again and couldn't hold back her outburst, which resulted in laughter from the children, furthering Alice's sense of inferiority. On the way back, despite Joe's objections, Alice played music on her phone. This triggered something in Joe, causing her to once again see scenes from the space station, almost causing them to have a car accident. Upon returning home, the colleague unexpectedly dropped by uninvited. He came to confront Magnus, openly declaring his intention to run away with Joe. Joe was stunned speechless. She couldn't remember having any involvement with him. Magnus felt betrayed and demanded Joe to confess. The colleague insinuated that Joe might be suffering from some mental issues, and as he left, he warned Magnus to call him immediately if Joe exhibited any extreme behavior. Furious, Magnus stormed upstairs, leaving Joe feeling like her life was falling apart. She accidentally noticed a package on the table containing 2 cassette tapes. One was recordings of Joe's voice from her time at the space station. Curiously, she played it and heard a hoarse male voice before her own. The other cassette was a recording from a female astronaut who died in 1967. It also started with a hoarse male voice. Just then, Alice was awakened by the noise and came downstairs to find the living room hosting Joe's memorial service. Another version of Alice suddenly turned to look at her, but all these visions disappeared in an instant. Seeing Alice frightened, Magnus instinctively put her back into the closet. Joe felt this was inappropriate, but Magnus thought her reaction was excessive. Wasn't this what they always did? He believed Joe really needed to take the medication, but Joe saw it as a conspiracy. They wanted to trick her into taking tranquilizers to cover up what she saw in space. Magnus picked up the phone to call her colleague, further enraging Joe. She forcefully pushed Magnus to the ground, and he fell silent. Although Magnus fainted, the phone had already connected to the colleague's number. Joe quickly hung up the call and dialed the emergency center, explaining the situation. After that, Joe hurriedly packed up and left with Alice. She couldn't shake the feeling that the command center was against her, the most likely reason being to cover up the fact that she saw a female corpse in space. Otherwise, why would they give her psychiatric medication? The previously received magnetic tape recording was even stranger, containing recordings of Joe's conversations between the space station and the command center, but Joe remembered very clearly that communication with the space station was clearly interrupted during that time. In order to uncover the truth, Joe returned to the command center again. She wanted to see if there were any communication records in the archives from that time. However, her access was too low, and she couldn't access anything. The only thing she could open was the recording of the dual quantum experiment before the space station collision accident. Joe had a sudden idea and immediately ran to the lab to pull out the experimental equipment. Regardless of whether the experiment was related to the space station accident, she decided to take the equipment away for further study before making any conclusions. The next crucial step was to escape the city with Alice. As they passed by a restaurant, they sat down to eat. Joe was curious why Alice liked to hide in closets. In Joe's memory, Alice had never had this habit. Alice's response made her face pale. She said there was a woman who often said strange things, making her feel scared, so she hid. Joe believed this was Alice's hallucination. To help Alice face her fear, she suggested Alice draw the woman. Then she turned and dialed a number on a public phone. The person who sent the recording tape officially sent it. Joe originally planned to visit, but the person on the other end hung up without hesitation. She was curious and looked up the sender's information. Online information showed that the person had served 6 months in prison for forging recordings. Joe felt a wave of dizziness. She confirmed that the contents of the tape were not forged because she had indeed said those things on the space station. After calming down, Joe called Magnus to inquire about his condition, but at that moment, Alice approached her holding the portrait she had just drawn. Joe recognized the person in the drawing as the astronaut's corpse she had seen in space. She looked at Alice in disbelief. She had never mentioned this incident to Alice before. The succession of bizarre events prompted Joe to investigate them all thoroughly. She first went to the sender's house of the tape, where a well-dressed old lady came out after Joe explained her purpose. It was her brother who had hung up the phone earlier. They were amateur astronomers who once intercepted a communication record from the space station using an old monitoring device. However, the official stance was that they had never received such communication. So, the siblings began recording these communications, which led to them being sued by the command center and imprisoned. Recently, after hearing about Joe's sighting of the astronaut's corpse in space, which Irina vehemently denied, they sent her the tape. It was very similar to the communications they intercepted, clearly existing, yet the command center refused to acknowledge it. The brother was worried about causing unnecessary trouble again, but the old lady felt that Joe should be helped to understand the truth. The communication records from the space station on the tape had not even been received by the command center, but the old lady had recorded them using an old-fashioned monitoring device. Alice saw a familiar face in the photo on the table. It was Henry from his youth. It turned out that Henry had been here before. He had tried to get back the recording of the Apollo program. Joe remembered an accident that had occurred during that space program, and Henry was the only survivor, after which he seemed to have changed completely. The old lady suddenly silenced him. It turned out that the siblings had been under surveillance from the Space Center all along. She told Joe that if he wanted to know the truth, he should accompany her on a trip to the sea. She said that the universe often experiences inexplicable phenomena. 6 astronauts once saw a purple light ball on the space station, which even made it into the newspapers. As the small cargo ship slowly started up, she said they needed to sail forward for 8 nautical miles, where there was a boundary between 2 spaces, where they could capture some sounds that are usually unheard of. She then took out a box of tapes, inside of which was the communication record of a female astronaut before she encountered an accident in 1967. After a crackling sound of electric current, the voice of a woman was heard, and she had checked that the only female astronaut who took off that day was Irina, but she safely returned to Earth afterward. So, who was the dead woman? Seeing Joe lost in thought, she started playing another tape, and to Joe's horror, it was the voice of the deceased commander. Joe's face changed drastically. She felt that this was fabricated, as she had seen the other person die with her own eyes on the space station. The old lady's expression turned stern as she spoke. She said that more than 500 people have been to space for exploration, and many of them were later diagnosed with mental illness. However, these were all top talents who underwent rigorous screening and training. How could they easily suffer mental breakdowns? It's obvious that someone is covering up some truth, and there's definitely some secret in space that they don't want the public to know. Joe felt overwhelmed by the amount of information and needed to go back and digest it. Before parting ways, the old lady gave her several tapes. Joe wanted to refuse, but she was insisted upon. Meanwhile, Henry was unaware that his experimental equipment had been stolen. Irina called him to tell him she had just read an article stating that a Nobel laureate in physics gave a speech emphasizing that the key point of quantum mechanics is the entanglement of 2 or more particles, where a change in one particle affects the state of another. Henry pondered over it. When he returned to the lab in a better mood, he found his equipment missing, and he trembled with excitement. He immediately called Irina, hoping she could help him. Wanting to calm down, Henry went to the bathroom, but he heard his own voice making a phone call. It turned out to be another Henry from a parallel universe talking on the phone. Henry seemed unfazed by this and wrote a message on the mirror using steam, which the other Henry actually saw. Despite his grim expression, he hung up the phone. On the other side, Henry found Joe's colleague and decided to join him in searching for Joe, suspecting she might have taken the experimental equipment. Since his experiment had already been shelved by the command center, no one cared about the theft. Suddenly, Henry rolled his eyes and found his pants soaked with urine. However, he firmly stated that he must accompany them to find Joe. After receiving a positive response, Henry quickly walked into the bathroom, his face full of anger, and unexpectedly greeted his reflection in the mirror. When Henry turned around again, the other Henry had already appeared in the mirror. Henry asked if he had stopped taking his medication, to which the other nodded, expressing a desire for revenge because Henry had sent the experimental equipment to the space station, resulting in a mess. The Henry in the mirror angrily stated, "I will definitely come to your world to settle the score," but Henry retorted, "You can't do that," to which the Henry in the mirror replied, "I can make you piss your pants." Meanwhile, Joe was taking Alice to a vacation cabin in the woods, her mind filled with too many questions. She asked Alice to play the tapes again, and surprisingly, the voices on the tapes were much clearer than before. Joe brought the recorder close to the experimental equipment, and to her amazement, there was no noise at all from the tape. Joe finally realized the peculiar nature of the experimental equipment. As they approached a fork in the road, Joe suddenly stopped the car, furrowing her brow because she remembered there wasn't supposed to be a fork in the road here. Alice told her to go left, and after passing a frozen lake, they finally arrived at the vacation cabin. Joe took out a box of tapes containing clear recordings of her communications with her daughter before the accident. When Joe heard Alice calling her, she immediately turned off the recorder. It turned out Alice had also heard the contents of the recordings, but she suddenly told Joe that the little girl in the recordings wasn't her because she couldn't speak Dutch, and she never called Joe Mom. This episode will peel back the mysterious veil behind various strange phenomena. Let's rewind to the moments before the space station accident. The commander was making final adjustments to the dual quantum entanglement experiment, and Joe was unaware that danger was looming. Suddenly, all communications were cut off, and the space station began to shake violently. Joe stumbled, and then she crashed directly into the window. When everything returned to calm, the commander followed the floating blood to find Joe embedded in the glass. Blood continued to gush from her head into the vacuum of space. He quickly stuffed tissues into the hole in the window, and then brought Joe's body down. Upon receiving the news of Joe's death, Magnus immediately took Alice to the command center. Along the way, the commander's daughter comforted Alice, assuring her that everything would pass. But in reality, all of this is happening in another parallel world, where Joe returns to Earth while the commander perishes. To console her, Alice even gives her beloved doll to commander's daughter. The events in the two parallel worlds unfold completely differently. What's even more perplexing is that the surviving commander distinctly remembers the experimental equipment sitting on the table, but after the incident, the equipment suddenly disappears. However, he doesn't have time to dwell on it because there are only 3 seats in the escape pod. Both the commander and the Joe from the other parallel world make the same decision, to stay behind and let their companions return to Earth first. As a result, all the strange events replay once again, but this time, the roles are reversed. The commander occasionally hears noises coming from the escape pod. When he changed the battery, he noticed that the white cloth covering Joe's head was floating up. He tries to secure it back in place, even leaning in to listen carefully. He felt like Joe was still alive because he could vividly hear her voice speaking in his ear. Feeling a sense of panic, the commander immediately reported to the command center, stating that Joe's wound had severe lacerations, and leaving the zero-gravity environment to return to Earth would surely result in massive bleeding. Without waiting for a response from the command center, he moved Joe's body out of the escape pod. He was prepared to leave her forever on the space station. Just before letting go, he deeply apologized, and then he felt Joe firmly grasp his hand. But when he came to his senses, he didn't see anything unusual. Meanwhile, Magnus found Alice hiding in the closet. He thought it was inappropriate for her to hide in the closet in the middle of the night. But Alice's demeanor suddenly changed drastically. She ignored her father's warning and directly closed the closet door. Magnus could only leave helplessly as Alice seemed to see Joe's figure, but when she opened the closet door, there was nothing there, echoing the scene when Joe saw the closet door earlier. It's highly likely that the dual quantum entanglement experiment caused the two worlds to overlap. The next day, while Alice and the commander's daughter were playing in the yard, the commander's wife poked her head out to tell her that her father was coming back. Alice's expression darkened. Her mother was coming back too, even though it was just a cold body. But Magnus brought another piece of bad news. Joe's body might have to stay on the space station forever. Meanwhile, the commander had finished changing the batteries and was ready to return to Earth in the escape pod. However, he encountered the same bolt malfunction, which required 2 people to fix simultaneously. After he pounded on the dashboard, the malfunction miraculously resolved itself. He couldn't believe his eyes as he stared at the space station. It seemed like there was someone standing by the window. Upon safely returning to Earth, he was warmly welcomed by friends and family, but everything felt surreal to the commander. Just a few days ago, his teammate was alive and well, and now she could only exist in the form of a tombstone. As he laid down the flowers, he suddenly saw Joe. But it disappeared in the blink of an eye. He didn't know this was the result of the overlapping of 2 worlds. He thought it was just an illusion. Facing Joe's family, he explained that leaving her on the space station was the only option, and then he began describing Joe's gruesome wound. Magnus noticed Alice's horrified expression and quickly pulled her away. Later, Alice walked into the parking lot with a gloomy expression, throwing her beloved doll on the ground and stomping on it until the commander's daughter came to stop her. But Alice was ungrateful and even gouged out the doll's eyes. The commander was deeply troubled by the frequent appearance of bizarre illusions. What's more surprising was that during the investigation meeting, when he mentioned the dual quantum entanglement experiment, everyone present, including his astronaut teammates, claimed that the space station had never conducted such an experiment, a fact corroborated by the surveillance videos from that time. The investigating committee then pointed out that the commander's decision to leave Joe's body on the space station without authorization from the command center was incomprehensible. While searching online for information about past astronaut launches, the commander was shocked to see a video of a rocket launch failure many years ago, where only one astronaut, named Henry, survived. The commander was astonished because he distinctly remembered that the launch was successful, despite mid-flight malfunctions that resulted in the deaths of 2 astronauts. Henry had bravely intervened and ensured the successful launch of the rocket. The commander rushed to the command center to meet Henry in person, as Henry was the initiator of the dual quantum entanglement experiment. However, the person in charge incredulously shook her head, stating that Henry had been in a decline since that mission and had retired long ago. It couldn't have been him who initiated the experiment. The commander was even more shocked because he distinctly remembered having a conversation with Henry before the space station accident. Despite their arguments, they couldn't reach any conclusion because they didn't know that the commander's symptoms were similar to Joe's. His body was in one world, but his memories belonged to another. This could be the result of the two worlds overlapping when the experimental device was activated. Realizing something was amiss, the commander began to reassess his life. He noticed that his way of addressing his wife and daughter seemed to make them uncomfortable, and even some small habits were intolerable to his present self. He couldn't shake the feeling that something unimaginable had happened on the space station. Similarly, Alice felt lost and enraged. She shredded the gift celebrating her mother's return, only to suddenly hear piano sound, even though there was no piano in the house. Magnus, observing the mess around him, felt that Joe's death had deeply affected Alice. He then sought help from a psychologist, who suggested holding a funeral for Joe, as the ritual could help the child cope with her grief. Magnus quickly arranged everything at home for the funeral, but Alice refused to come out of the closet. She insisted that Joe was still in space, and she couldn't bear to say goodbye to thin air. Helpless, Magnus had no choice but to go downstairs to attend to the guests. Meanwhile, the commander lingered at the door, unable to bring himself to enter. He felt it was his selfishness that had left Joe's body in space, and, more importantly, he believed Joe hadn't died at that moment. His wife's gaze was filled with pity, urging him to join them inside. Seeing her father's distracted demeanor, the daughter took matters into her own hands and brought Alice directly to him. Just as she finished speaking, Alice turned her head to see another version of herself. The commander was so shocked that he collapsed to the ground, while Alice couldn't help but scream at the sight of Joe's appearance. Afterwards, Magnus suggested taking Alice somewhere for a vacation to relax. Without hesitation, Alice expressed her desire to go to the cabin in the woods where Joe often went. On the other hand, the commander's wife woke up to find her husband missing. She then went to the person in charge at the command center to inquire about his whereabouts. The person in charge expressed heavily that many astronauts developed post-traumatic stress disorder after returning from space, often seeing all sorts of inexplicable entities. She advised the commander's wife to prepare herself psychologically because even if they found the commander, the command center would still suspend him from duty. Meanwhile, the commander unexpectedly arrived at Henry's residence. In this world, Henry seemed much more awkward, living in an unknown apartment. What surprised the commander even more was that Henry didn't recognize him. In the commander's memory, Henry was his mentor at the command center, and he recounted how Henry's efforts ensured the successful launch of the rocket. Henry's expression gradually turned cold as he realized that the commander was referring to another version of Henry from another world. Seeing the commander's probing demeanor, Henry took out a gun from the drawer. As Magnus and Alice continued their journey towards the cabin in the woods, they encountered a fork in the road. Magnus noticed that the path ahead was blocked by ice, suggesting they should head to the town and find a hotel to stay for the night. However, Alice remained adamant about reaching the cabin tonight, feeling a strong pull towards it. She was even willing to walk there if necessary. Reluctantly, Magnus agreed to accompany Alice, and they hurried towards the cabin. Upon arriving, they found the interior exactly as they remembered it, with the same decorations and paintings. Alice became lost in thought as she gazed at a mural on the wall, one of Joe's favorite artworks. Overwhelmed by emotions, Magnus couldn't hold back his tears, prompting Alice to comfort him, expressing her belief that Joe would surely reappear. In the night, Alice suddenly noticed a light outside the cabin. She approached the window and saw Joe slowly approaching. Alice hurried outside without even wearing her coat, but when she stepped out, there was nothing outside. She knew she wasn't seeing an illusion, so she put on her coat and decided to go look further away. At this moment, Alice had no understanding of quantum entanglement. The reason she was able to see Joe just now was because there was a brief overlap between two parallel worlds. Joe, who was in the other world, had just arrived at the cabin. She had previously taken the quantum experiment equipment and planned to bring Alice here for temporary shelter. However, before she could enter the cabin, she heard someone calling her "Mom" in the distance, even though Alice was clearly right beside her. After they entered the cabin, they listened to the tape over and over again, which contained a conversation between Alice and Joe before the space station accident. Alice firmly stated that the voice on the tape wasn't hers because she never spoke Dutch. What shocked Joe even more was when Alice mentioned Joe introducing the experimental equipment during a video chat. However, Joe distinctly remembered that the space station had never conducted any experiments on quantum entanglement. This aligns perfectly with the plot from the previous episode where the commander's body existed in this world but his memories remained in another, which is why he insisted during the meeting that they were conducting quantum experiments while the command center stated that the experiment had been cancelled years ago. After listening to all the tapes, they gradually realized the existence of parallel worlds, especially a segment where the commander asked if Joe's body could be left on the space station. Alice finally said what she had been holding back for so long. She didn't believe the Joe in front of her was her real mother. This truth, though cruel, was also something Joe had been feeling, and she decided to uncover the truth. While outside storing the experimental equipment, Joe heard Alice's cry again. She couldn't believe it and rushed back to the cabin to find Alice already asleep. Was someone else calling her? Joe anxiously headed towards the source of the voice. Unfortunately, the Alice calling for her mother was actually in another parallel world, and the two never met halfway. After walking for a while, Alice saw the lights in front of the cabin. She didn't understand why there was an identical house here, with the keys hidden in the same place. Upon opening the door, she found the interior decor almost identical to her own cabin, but she searched every room and found no sign of Joe. Alice climbed into the closet on the second floor. The wind blew the closet door shut, causing panic as she frantically banged on the door and called for Joe. Suddenly, Joe heard the cries behind her and quickly turned around to see the cabin not far away illuminated by light. Not long after, the distressed Alice suddenly noticed that the closet door had been opened and Joe appeared before her eyes. Joe was equally trembling with excitement. She quickly brought Alice back to her own cabin, carefully sniffed the scent of Alice's hair, and confirmed that the Alice in front of her was indeed her daughter. Joe ran a bath for her, only to discover another Alice lying in bed. She felt dizzy for a moment, and when Joe came back to her senses, the Alice in the bathtub had disappeared, leaving only the Alice who had just woken up. Joe was certain that what she had just experienced wasn't an illusion. She told Alice that there was another cabin on the other side of the woods, and she had to find her daughter. The Alice in this world looked puzzled. Alice watched her mother's hurried departure and could only helplessly follow along. Meanwhile, the Alice from the other world was unaware that the two overlapping worlds had separated. After calling out for her mother, she realized that the hot water in the bathtub was gone. She quickly wrapped herself in a towel and walked out of the bathroom, coincidentally encountering Magnus who had just woken up. Alice told him that she had encountered Joe, but Magnus dismissed it as her imagination running wild. Instead of explaining further, Alice waited until Magnus fell asleep again before leaving the cabin once more. She was convinced that there was another cabin at the other end of the forest, and Joe must be there. Meanwhile, Joe was leading the Alice from this world into the forest. Alice believes that the cabin she saw does not exist. After reuniting with the Alice from the other world, Joe's heart confirmed that the Alice in front of her was not her daughter. Alice quickly retorted, asking if she wasn't her mother, then who was she? Then, in retaliation, she snatched the backpack and casually threw it into the snow. She then planned to go home to find Magnus, but halfway there, she indeed stumbled upon a small cabin. Curious, Alice went inside to investigate and found that, apart from the murals on the walls, everything else was almost identical to her own cabin. She noticed a tape recorder on the table and decided to take it with her as she climbed into the closet upstairs. In the other world, Alice accidentally found a bead in the snow and took a few steps forward, only to spot Joe's backpack containing the experimental equipment. She guessed that Joe must be nearby, and her steps quickened. Soon enough, she arrived at the abandoned cabin, skillfully opening the door to find a live kitten inside. However, when the other Alice entered, she found a dead cat. Out of habit, she walked into the closet and discovered a tape recorder inside. Pressing the play button, she heard her own voice. It turned out the other Alice was also in the closet, recording her voice with the same tape recorder. Although they were in different parallel worlds, they were able to communicate across space through the tape recorder. Not long after, Joe also found the small cabin. She heard the sounds coming from the closet from a distance. Upon opening the closet door, she found nothing inside except for a tape recorder still playing Alice's voice. Joe realized that the Alice who had thrown her backpack must have returned to her own world, so she picked up the tape recorder and drove off to find her. However, she didn't notice that the kerosene lamp left on the table had been blown down by the strong wind, igniting the room. Joe suddenly felt a surge of panic as she listened to the conversation between the two Alices playing on the tape recorder. Although they were in parallel worlds, they saw each other through the mirror and talked about their experiences, even mentioning details like the color of the cars at their homes. Now they finally confirmed that parallel worlds truly existed. While driving, Joe suddenly noticed a bright light rising behind her. Realizing that the cabin was on fire, she quickly turned around, but as she sped towards the burning house, it transformed into her own cabin. Without hesitation, she rushed inside, but upon entering, the cabin turned back into the one where she found the tape recorder. Flames were burning on the mural on the wall, and the cat on the floor was dead, while a black cat wandered around. Joe didn't have time to delve into it and hurriedly ran upstairs. The Alice from this world was indeed hiding in the closet. However, what puzzled Joe was that she could hear the voice of the Alice from the other world through the tape recorder, but her own voice couldn't transmit over there. It could only be relayed by the Alice from this world. Joe vowed to find a way to reunite with the Alice from the other world. Just then, the raging flames broke through the mural, and thick smoke rose to the second floor. When the mirror in the closet shattered, flames spread from all around. Joe quickly grabbed Alice and ran outside. Meanwhile, Magnus was leading Henry and others towards the cabin in the woods. However, the road ahead was blocked by ice and snow, so they had to proceed on foot. Henry seemed to sense something and walked in another direction. Surprisingly, he found the backpack containing the experimental equipment in the snow, and the rising flames ahead also caught his attention. However, he kept recalling the commander's questioning, realizing that this was something happening in another world. With a gunshot, the two Henrys from different worlds were stunned as their consciousness unexpectedly swapped. After Joe escaped, she handed Alice to Henry, but he inexplicably left her lying on the snowy ground. This was because the Henry from the other world had long resigned from the command center and didn't recognize Alice, while the Henry from this world had many responsibilities. Upon seeing the commander fall, he immediately dialed for emergency assistance. However, Joe, rushing into the house, did not find the Alice from the other world. As she emerged, she was shocked to find Alice lying alone in the snow, her life hanging by a thread due to the freezing temperature. Joe immediately began emergency aid. However, when she turned her head, she unexpectedly saw the Alice from the other world. This Alice wanted to take Joe home, but Joe made the rational choice to save the unconscious Alice. At that moment, Magnus' call could be heard nearby. After Joe ensured Alice was with her father, personnel from the command center arrived, and the overlapping worlds separated once again. The Alice from the other world reunited with Magnus. Finally, Joe managed to revive the Alice from this world, but her real daughter had disappeared without a trace. Later, lying on the hospital bed, the Alice from this world dreamt of the astronaut's corpse and expressed her desire to take Alice to meet her real mother. The next moment, she woke up from the dream, wondering where Joe had gone. Magnus informed her that Irina had taken Joe away. Alice was shocked and insisted on rescuing Joe no matter what. Joe was taken away by the hastily arriving rescue team. After a long journey, she was taken to a monastery in the suburbs. Irina looked coldly as several nurses skillfully connected wires to Joe's head. Meanwhile, Henry, who woke up in the snow, picked up experimental equipment. His gaze gradually darkened, and then he raised an axe and forcefully struck the instrument, the sound of shattering echoing in the space. At this moment, Joe also fell into a deep sleep. She didn't know how long it had been before she woke up from her slumber, looking around at the unfamiliar surroundings, feeling a wave of panic in her heart, especially when she found that the door was locked from the outside. The next day, Irina walked in calmly and advised Joe to relax, suggesting that she sit down and play a tune. However, Joe was only concerned about Alice in the small cabin. Irina told her that Alice had just been discharged from the hospital and was waiting for her at home. Joe shook her head, saying that the Alice they mentioned was not her daughter. "You've been hiding the truth from me, and the tranquilizers you gave me are the evidence." Irina patiently explained that when they were at the recovery center, they found out that Joe was pregnant, so they prescribed her different medication. Joe couldn't believe it and knocked over the pills in disbelief. At that moment, a low sobbing sound came from the ceiling, and Irina, with a grim expression, indicated that there was an incurable patient living upstairs. Joe gathered her courage and began to recount the contents of the recording from another world's Irina before the accident at the space station. Irina's face turned pale, and she hastily left the room. Meanwhile, back at home, Alice solemnly told Magnus that his Joe was already dead, and the current Joe was from another world. However, Magnus refused to believe such an absurd notion. The next morning at breakfast, Alice proposed to Magnus that she wanted to go to the monastery to see Joe. The consciousness-swapped Henry was escorted to the interrogation room by several officers because he had shot the commander yesterday. He insisted that he didn't fire the gun, but he couldn't explain that his consciousness had actually swapped with another Henry from a different world. The real culprit had crossed over to Joe's world. To clear his name, he suggested using a lie detector to question him. Meanwhile, in the other world, Henry was feeling on top of the world. Compared to his previous miserable life, his current existence was like paradise. He accused Joe of damaging the experimental equipment and ultimately blamed all the problems on her, attributing them to mental issues caused by space travel. Later, he received a call from Irina, who said she needed to urgently meet him, and they agreed to meet at a restaurant. Henry was thrilled to see this legendary woman because in his previous world, Irina, as the second woman to venture into space, was the goddess of all astronauts. However, Henry's expression quickly turned cold as he realized that the Irina he knew had died in an aerospace accident. The person sitting across from him was in the same situation as himself, physically in one world but mentally belonging to another. Henry's desire was for everything to remain as it was, so he asked Irina to continue concealing all the truths, which was also the reason he had destroyed the experimental equipment. Meanwhile, Jo, in the monastery, encountered an old acquaintance, a colleague she had previously worked with on the space station. Jo thought this person would understand everything she said, but to her surprise, the colleague's demeanor changed drastically. He claimed that Jo had contracted a common ailment among astronauts, constantly suspecting things around her, and insisted that she must cooperate with treatment. Furthermore, he revealed that he would soon inherit Irina's position at the command center. Enraged, Jo knocked on the door and gestured for him to leave. Before leaving, the colleague discreetly handed Jo something. When she unfolded it, she found it to be 2 keys. Later that night, she used one of the keys to unlock the door. Just as she was about to leave, Jo suddenly remembered the sobbing she had heard during the day. Quietly, she made her way upstairs, where she found a room with a closed door at the corner. Curiously, she opened the window of the door and was shocked to see 2 identical elderly men inside. Trembling with fear, Jo quickly ran back to her room because she realized that even if she escaped, she would soon be caught again. Irina was very satisfied with Jo's behavior and told her that the elderly man upstairs was the first man to venture into outer space, but he suffered from severe stress disorders. Jo understood this as a warning that if she didn't cooperate with treatment, she would also end up lonely and aging here. Meanwhile, Alice was chatting with the commander's daughter in the closet. She mentioned that Jo wasn't her real mother, which the girl envied. Alice at least had someone like a mother to accompany her, while she would never see her father again. Conversely, in another parallel dimension, Alice envied her father's safe return. After ending the video chat, both Alice emerged from the closet simultaneously. The Alice from this world asked Magnus when he would go to see Jo and casually took out a radio from the box. On the other hand, the Alice from the other world was preparing to leave this place of sorrow. While packing, she noticed the radio in the corner and tentatively pressed the play button. She wanted to talk to the Jo in the other world. However, although the Alice from this world heard the request, she did not respond. The words of her friend had made her realize that having an unfamiliar mother by her side was better than having nothing at all. Not receiving a response, she finally accepted reality. Perhaps Jo's choice back then had already said it all. Jo stayed with the Alice in this world, and she didn't leave with her. The other Alice assured Magnus that she would never mention the deceased Jo again. At this moment, Jo sat in front of the unfamiliar piano, instinctively dancing her fingers to produce beautiful melodies once again. She felt like a traveler trapped in a foreign land, longing for home but helpless. Just then, Irina pushed the door open and entered. Jo calmly asked her if she was already dead. There were actually 2 Irina, and Jo's situation was exactly the same as hers. Irina didn't deny it but simply stated that understanding this truth wouldn't help change the situation. The noise outside interrupted their conversation, revealing Magnus and Alice's arrival. They both went to the backyard and had an open and honest conversation. The Alice from this world displayed a maturity beyond her age. Since one person needed a daughter and the other needed a mother, they could try to act like mother and daughter, as this had already become reality. Jo's inner turmoil vanished in an instant. Why had she been agonizing over something even a child could understand? Perhaps it was time to bid farewell to the past and embrace a new life. Both worlds Magnus shared the joy in this transformation. All they hoped for was that their daughter or wife could return to normalcy and not be lost in their thoughts all the time. Now, both Alice and Jo achieved this, and the 2 Magnus finally got the life they wanted. However, Henry, who had undergone consciousness swapping, wasn't as fortunate. After calmly answering all the questions posed by the police following the lie detector test, he repeatedly emphasized that he didn't shoot the commander. The test results came out quickly, confirming that Henry was telling the truth. However, the police believed that it was his subjective judgment that he hadn't committed a crime, but the objective fact was the fingerprint evidence collected at the scene. Henry also faced another charge, murdering the detective investigating him on the cruise ship. Poor Henry bore the brunt of unjust accusations. On the other hand, the instigator Henry swaggered into the city center. He found the detective who had been investigating him, but in this world they had no connection. Henry affectionately hugged him before leaving the detective standing there dumbfounded. Irina, who was about to retire from her position at the space agency, keenly felt the anguish and pain Joe had experienced. So, she revealed her own crimes online. For years, she had been tasked by the authorities with concealing incidents of strange occurrences during space travel. Perhaps the unexplained phenomena witnessed by returning astronauts were indeed real, but they were covered up by her using various excuses. In another world, the commander in the hospital bed woke up, his excitement akin to experiencing a resurrection. Meanwhile, in the space station, the long-deceased Joe suddenly grabbed the photograph in front of her.